is quite substantial in relative terms. The military in conflict zones do not have humanitarian aims when they conduct humanitarian operations. They have military tactical aims to increase their own security and the security of the local environment. Usually they call this hearts and minds operations, and there are so many dubious assumptions within these concepts. For example, the idea that if we hand out blankets and food to the local population, they will like us better, and thereby our security will be increased, they will give us more information. To me, that is almost a neo-colonial and quite insulting view of local Afghanistani population's political behavior. If it's that simple, if we can hand them blankets and they will support the operations, things would be very simple. But it doesn't work that way. When it comes to civil-military relations in general, there's also the assumption that if we only coordinate better, if there's better cooperation in the field, we will be more effective. Now, when there's complex political aims like state building, democratization, there's no doubt both military, humanitarian and development aspects, political aspects will need to be involved, and they will need to be coordinated. But we should think very hard about what exactly we want to achieve by coordinating civil-military actors and by having them cooperate, and in what way we think that that will lead to some increased effectiveness. If we can't explain how coordination and cooperation will lead to increased effectiveness, perhaps we should wait a minute and let these actors do their thing like they have done before with some level of effectiveness. That's my starting point in this debate.
I'm still going to come back to you to get some answers on exactly when and when not, so that we can perhaps have something to take out of this meeting and this debate today to the plenary, and maybe from there onwards further. But I think it's time to open the floor first of all. We have a roaming microphone. Are we using this one on the table as the roaming microphone, or do you have another one at the back? I'm not sure who all want questions. I already saw a hand raised right here in the front. Could I please ask that, for the sake of everybody, that you identify yourself and that you state your question or your point of view very clearly. Thank you.
I'm Professor Hans Küng, President of the Global Ethics Foundation. I'm very grateful to Robert that you raised a real question today. I think it's really the question in what you precisely said about the conflict zones, and especially Afghanistan, whether we need more or less military involvement. I think it is interesting that maybe the more military involvement you have, the less humanitarian involvement you get. And it will be interesting to compare the strategy of the Americans in Afghanistan and the strategy of the Germans. The German government was only able to convince the parliament and the German population, which still wanted to get out, as a matter of fact. You have no majority in the German people for the military involvement in Afghanistan. They always said, well, we are for the humanitarian approach. And they made a few efforts, of course, and I think everybody here agrees that it is very difficult for militaries to have humanitarian works achieved. They achieved several things, not only giving fruits, but also schools and hospitals, but that's not very much for the whole country. I was already in Afghanistan in '71, flying over the Hindu Kush from Tashkent, and I thought, as a Swiss citizen, I would never make a war down there. And I know a former German chancellor who told me, if the German army will go up there, they will not come down in 1 year, maybe not only in decades. So they are now trapped. As a matter of fact, yesterday they had again 3 dead German soldiers. That's, of course, the best argument to have the real problems discussed. This morning, the Minister of Defense, he said, we are still not at war, we are basically humanitarian, but there is nothing left of all that. And as a matter of fact, the humanitarian organizations are complaining that the army destroyed their activities. And they cannot see, they always said Kunduz and the north is more secure. Now they say, well, it's equally insecure. But the German army was more and more involved. AWACS, now planes are involved. And I think they are practically now in full war. The Minister of Defense said, yes, well, we can fight back. Well, how? It's very difficult to fight back in Afghanistan. It's asymmetrical, as we know. So I think it will really be important to discuss whether this is really the right strategy. As a matter of fact, the German strategy and the American have now, are practically the same now, because the Germans are involved as much in the military as the Americans. And so we are in a very big mess. I think we have to see that we are in a very big mess and nobody knows how to get out. So I think the question you have is serious for the climate change.
Well, Hans, I couldn't agree with you more because as an American, I think we're getting into a deeper and deeper mess. But, you know, it's a fig leaf now. The only way that we can get other nations to contribute to the Afghan business is to call it humanitarian. Otherwise, they're not willing to come, or their laws prohibit them from coming. So some of them, like the Japanese, are very careful. They don't go over the line. Others, of course, go over the line. And we will have a blurring in a conflict zone like Afghanistan, no question about it. What is humanitarian? What is military? Particularly when the mission is a mixed mission. It's, as you said earlier, to get the people to come over to you on hearts and minds. That's how you're going to win the military situation, all of which is questionable. But that's where we are, in a big mess in Afghanistan. But let's put Afghanistan aside for a moment, talk about a place like Chad, which, yes, you're there in a peacekeeping operation, but as you said earlier, it was not only the result of drought, it was the result of drought that caused Darfur, that caused crossover from the border, that caused an insecure situation between two states, that did indeed cause a grave security threat, which we have in that region. So humanitarian mixes with political and with military in many places other than in an extreme case like the American situation in Afghanistan. And that's what I was arguing, Robert, that's what it's going to be, whether or not, you know, you think is right or you think is wrong. We're past that. And I think the biggest question now is, how do we constitute these forces? Are they going to come in as peacekeeping forces? And if so, what is their mandate? Is the Security Council going to send forces strictly on humanitarian issues, which they could well do if they feel it's a threat to the region? What are the terms of engagement? And once again, the age-old question of where do you get the forces? You know, every time there's a disaster, of whether it's political or environmental, I remember Kofi on the telephone the last time around in Gaza, desperate. I was in his office. I mean, he must have made 200 calls in the course of a few days trying to put together anybody and anyone who was willing to come in and do something, which is not a solution. Will we have a standing force? We've often talked about a UN standing force, but so far as I know, none of the P5 are willing to contribute to it. If you called it a standing humanitarian military force, would they be more willing? I don't know. There are a lot of people thinking about that now. Would it help us if we had a standing force constituted to go in quickly in an emergency situation that are well trained under a unified commander? Because the biggest issue in the field, as all you military guys know, is that these forces today, maybe not a European force, but the other UN forces, they're ragtag force. They're made up of this one and that one and any one that you can get. They have different concepts. They're not well trained, many of them. I don't know how a commander takes charge of a force like that. And there are every kind of problems, not only within the force, but then dealing with the NGOs and the civilian community, and above all else, the local forces, the local police and the local army, whatever they may be in the region. So I think we got a lot of work ahead of us.